It begins in the silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels mature or safe. I'm talking about the kind that makes your chest tighten when your phone stays dark. The kind that turns minutes into stories and stories into wounds. The kind that makes you reread old messages just to prove to yourself that what happened between you was real. Because when an avoidant pulls away, they don't leave with noise. They leave with absence, with half-finished warmth, with eyes that once softened for you suddenly looking somewhere past you, as if feeling too much became a room they had to escape. And that is what makes it so brutal. You're not grieving a clean ending. You're grieving confusion, mixed signals, tenderness with no consistency, closeness followed by coldness, the memory of someone who held you like you mattered and then disappeared like they were afraid of what that meant. And if you've been caught in that kind of bond, then you know this pain has a very specific shape. It doesn't just make you sad, it makes you doubt your own reality. It makes you ask the question that quietly destroys people from the inside out. If they loved me, why did they run? That question can haunt a person for months, years sometimes, because somewhere deep down you sensed something real. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't all in your head. There were moments when their guard dropped, when their voice changed, when their touch lingered, when their eyes said what their mouth could not. There were moments when you could feel the truth under all their defenses. And that is the scary truth. When an avoidant loves you, it does not always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like inconsistency. Sometimes it looks like retreat. Sometimes it looks like someone trying not to drown in feelings they never learned how to survive. That's the part most people never understand. You keep expecting love to create movement toward you. But in an avoidant nervous system, love can trigger the exact opposite. Not because it means less, because it means more. Too much more. And before we go any further, here is the brutal truth you may not want to hear, but you need to. The more you chase an avoidant for reassurance, the more you become the symbol of the pressure they cannot regulate. The more you demand clarity in the middle of their panic, the more their system registers you not as safety, but as overwhelm. That doesn't mean your needs are wrong. It means your pursuit and their fear are colliding in the dark, and both people end up bleeding. See, people love to reduce avoidant behavior to something simple. They don't care. They're playing games. If they wanted to, they would. But human attachment is rarely that clean, especially when someone learned early in life that closeness comes with danger, expectation, engulfment, criticism, or loss of self. When connection starts becoming real, the avoidant system does not say, "This is beautiful, let me relax into it." It says, "This is dangerous, control it before it controls you." That response is not poetry, it's biology. When an avoidant starts falling deeply, their amygdala, the part of the brain scanning for threat, can misread emotional intimacy as risk. Their body begins reacting before their logic catches up. Cortisol rises, the nervous system shifts into self-protection. Their chest feels tight, their thoughts speed up, their need for space suddenly becomes urgent. And because dopamine is tied to anticipation and distance, they may feel safer desiring love than actually receiving it. That's why they can miss you terribly and still not text. That's why they can think about you constantly and still act detached. That's why they can feel love and behave like absence. To someone on the outside, it looks cold. Inside them, it often feels like drowning. This is what makes loving an avoidant so psychologically disorienting. You see tenderness in flashes. You feel connection in private. You sense devotion in the spaces between their words. But every time it gets deeper, something inside them pulls the emergency brake. And if you don't understand what's happening, you make the most human mistake of all. You personalize it. You think, I was too much. I asked for too much. I loved too deeply. If I had been calmer, prettier, softer, less emotional, more understanding, they would have stayed open. No. Let that land. No. Their withdrawal is not proof that you were unlovable. It is proof that intimacy activated unfinished survival patterns inside them. They didn't stop caring. They felt overwhelmed by caring. And those are not the same thing. That distinction can save you years of self-abandonment. Because once you understand this, you stop reading every retreat as rejection. You stop turning their fear into your unworthiness. You stop trying to earn calm from someone whose nervous system only knows control. But here is where it gets even darker. Just because they love you does not mean they can love you well. That may be the hardest truth of all. Someone can feel deeply for you and still disappear. Someone can crave you and still punish closeness. Someone can be terrified to lose you and still create the very distance that loses you. Someone can love you in their heart and fail you in their behavior. And if you confuse inner feeling with relational capacity, you will stay in loops that slowly erase your self-worth. Because you will live on potential, on almost, on maybe, on the hope that if you just hold on long enough, their fear will finally lose to their love. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes fear wins for a very long time. This is why the core concept that changes everything is silence. Not performative silence, not silence used as revenge, not silence loaded with secret hope that they'll panic and come running. I mean sacred silence. Non-reactive silence. Self-respecting silence. The kind of silence that says, I will no longer interrupt my own healing just to keep your nervous system comfortable. Because the moment you stop chasing, something shifts. Not just in them, in you. Up until then, your energy has likely been pouring outward, analyzing, anticipating, explaining, reaching, soothing, trying to say the perfect thing in the perfect tone at the perfect time to unlock a version of them that only appears in fragments. It's exhausting. And even worse, it trains your body to associate love with hypervigilance, with waiting, with emotional labor, with self-suppression, with constantly checking for changes in temperature. That is not love. That is survival dressed up as devotion. When you go silent in the right way, you interrupt the entire pattern. No more double texts trying to decode distance. No more emotional essays sent into someone's shutdown. No more bargaining with the bare minimum because you're addicted to the rare moments they open. You step back, and for the first time, the avoidant is left alone with what your presence had been regulating for them. Your reassurance, gone. Your emotional availability, gone. Your constant reaching, gone. Your predictability, gone. And now something unexpected happens. The very distance they thought they needed, starts to feel different than they imagined. At first, they may feel relief, space, control, a chance to breathe. This is the part that terrifies people, because it makes you think, see, they're fine without me. But don't confuse nervous system decompression with emotional indifference. Those are not the same thing either. Once the pressure is gone, once the emotional intensity quiets, once your energy is no longer chasing them, the avoidant no longer has someone external to focus on resisting. And that is when the internal world gets loud. That is when your absence starts echoing. That is when they notice the missing ritual. Your name not lighting up their screen. Your warmth no longer available on demand. The person who understood them in ways they never admitted, now inaccessible. The emotional home they couldn't stay inside, suddenly gone. And because avoidants often process emotion in delay, they frequently feel the loss after the distance, not during it. This is the part nobody tells you. While you were losing sleep in real time, they may have been numbing. While you were crying, they may have been compartmentalizing. While you were trying to make sense of the rupture, they may have been running on autopilot. But later, when the dust settles and the threat level drops, feeling leaks through. They start remembering the softness they couldn't tolerate. They replay conversations. They notice the emptiness. They miss your voice in ordinary moments. They feel the ache they outran. And if the bond was real, if your connection reached deeper than surface validation, if you touched a place inside them that few people ever do, then yes, they may begin to chase in their own way. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it begins as curiosity, a check-in, a song, a strange late-night message, a question that pretends not to mean much, a sudden return with no explanation, a vague, "I've been thinking about you," a soft opening disguised as casualness because direct vulnerability still feels too dangerous. But understand this clearly. The power does not shift because they miss you. The power shifts because you stopped abandoning yourself. That is the real transformation. Because when you stop reacting, you become harder to control, harder to predict, harder to keep in the old dynamic where they withdraw and you pursue. And for an avoidant, unpredictability in your absence can trigger reflection in a way emotional confrontation never could. Why? Because now they are not managing your reaction. They are facing their own. Now they have room to feel. And feeling is what they were avoiding all along. Imagine them at night, phone in hand, looking at your name and putting the phone down, picking it up again, telling themselves they just need space, telling themselves you were too intense, telling themselves they did the right thing, then hearing your laugh in memory, then remembering the way you looked at them when they softened, then noticing how quiet their world has become without the person who saw through them. This is where obsession can begin. Not because you played a game, because your absence removed the anesthesia. And suddenly, what they once kept at arm's length begins moving toward them from the inside. The memories, the longing, the grief, the tenderness, the regret, the possibility that they pushed away the very person who made them feel most alive. That is terrifying for an avoidant, because wanting you from a distance is one thing, needing to admit it is another. And some of them will break. They'll come back too fast, too emotional, too hungry. They'll say they miss you. They'll say no one understands them like you do. They'll say they got scared. They'll open just enough to pull you back into hope. This is why you need to hear the warning. Just because they return does not mean the pattern is broken. Missing you is not healing. Regret is not transformation. A moment of vulnerability is not emotional availability. And love, no matter how intense, is not enough without capacity. If nothing inside them has changed, if they still equate closeness with loss of control, if they still shut down instead of communicating, if they still use distance to regulate what they refuse to name, then the reunion will only restart the cycle. And cycles are dangerous, because each return feels like proof. Proof that they cared, proof that the bond was real, proof that you were right to wait. But sometimes it is only proof that attachment wounds know how to find each other again. Read that twice. Because if you are not careful, you will mistake being unforgettable for being chosen well. You can haunt someone and still not be safe with them. You can be the one they never get over and still not be the one they can sustain. You can be deeply loved in the private chambers of a wounded heart and still be deeply mishandled in real life. This is why your silence must never be a strategy to win them back. It has to be a return to yourself. That's the line that changes everything. The moment your energy stops asking, "How do I make them feel enough to stay?" and starts asking, "Why was I willing to shrink just to be felt at all?" your entire identity begins to shift. Now the story is no longer about decoding them. It becomes about reclaiming you. Your body softens. Your mind clears. The obsession lifts. You start hearing your own intuition again. You start recognizing what you normalized, the emotional crumbs, the inconsistency, the intimacy that only arrived on their terms, the way you learned to celebrate tiny moments of closeness because the baseline had become deprivation. And then something almost sacred happens. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You realize that being wanted in bursts is not the same as being loved consistently. You realize that chemistry can exist inside dysfunction. You realize that your empathy became a doorway through which you kept excusing pain. You realize that understanding someone's wound does not require you to live inside it. That awareness is power. Real power. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, not the kind that needs them to see what they lost. The kind that makes you unavailable for what once broke you. And, ironically, that is often when they feel you most. Because now your energy has changed. You are no longer reaching from hunger. You are no longer vibrating with fear of loss. You are no longer waiting at the emotional door for scraps of certainty. You are standing in your own life again, in your own rhythm, in your own worth. That kind of detachment is magnetic because it is no longer trying to magnetize. And avoidants feel that. They feel when your nervous system no longer revolves around theirs. They feel when your silence is no longer a protest, but a peace. They feel when they can no longer access the version of you who would always understand, always forgive, always remain emotionally available while asking for almost nothing in return. That is when the fantasy of independence can crack. That is when they begin to wonder if losing you was not freedom, but loss. That is when your absence becomes real. That is when they may chase, miss, obsess, spiral, reach. But listen carefully. Their realization is not your responsibility. Their awakening is not your assignment. Their fear is not your burden to soothe anymore. You are not here to prove that love can save someone who is committed to hiding from it. You are here to become someone who no longer has to beg to be met. And maybe that is the scariest truth of all. Not that an avoidant can love you and still run, but that once you truly understand this, once you stop personalizing their retreat, once you stop feeding the cycle with your panic, once you stop measuring your worth by their capacity, you become free in a way they may not be. You become unreachable to the old pattern. You stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. You stop calling confusion depth. You stop mistaking silence for mystery. You stop trying to be chosen by people who only know how to love with one foot out the door. And in that freedom, your whole identity rearranges. Now you are not the one waiting. You are not the one chasing. You are not the one over-explaining your needs to someone committed to misunderstanding them. You are not the one reading breadcrumbs like prophecy. You are not the one collapsing every time someone withdraws. You are the one who sees clearly. You are the one who can feel love without losing yourself inside it. You are the one who can recognize wounded tenderness without volunteering to be wounded by it. You are the one who knows that being deeply felt is beautiful, but being deeply respected is non-negotiable. So if an avoidant loved you and ran, let the truth set you free instead of keeping you attached. Yes, they may have loved you. Yes, they may still think about you. Yes, your absence may shake them harder than they ever expected. But none of that defines your value. Their confusion is not your mirror. Their fear is not your verdict. Their inability to stay open is not evidence that you were too much. You were simply real enough to reach places in them they had spent a lifetime trying not to feel. And that is powerful. But your final power is this. You do not need to be the one they finally learn with. You do not need to be the wound that teaches them regret. You do not need to stand in the doorway of their healing, bleeding and hopeful, just in case they come back different. You get to leave the cycle. You get to choose peace over potential. You get to become the kind of person who no longer confuses being loved painfully with being loved well. And when that shift becomes real, something inside you goes quiet. Not empty, not numb, free. Because now, whether they return or not, whether they miss you or not, whether they finally understand your value or spend years running from the memory of it, your life is no longer suspended in their fear. It is rooted in your own worth. And that is the moment the whole story changes. Not when they text, not when they come back, not when they finally confess what they felt. When you no longer need any of it to know who you are. That is when the spell breaks. That is when the waiting ends. That is when you stop being the person who hopes love will choose you and become the person who chooses themselves so completely that anything less than true emotional presence can no longer enter unnoticed. And that kind of self-worth? It is not loud. It is not angry. It does not beg. It does not chase. It does not tremble at silence. It becomes the silence. Steady, unmoved, whole. And once you reach that place, the scariest truth is no longer what an avoidant feels for you. It is what you finally realize about yourself. You were never hard to love. You were just too real for someone who had spent their whole life hiding from real love. And now, finally, you no longer need to hide from it either.